Looking at the recent economic activities taking place worldwide, it is understandable if some of us are a bit confused about some of the terms that we hear these economists, researchers, and analysts harp on about on the news or whatever platform you may come across. One of these terms is GDP, and sometimes you may find that just like the term misogyny, some of us may not even know what GDP is and what it may represent. Well, you don't have to pretend any longer. In this video, we will be breaking down GDP so that it can finally make sense. With that in mind, join us as we give you guys the simplest way to understand GDP once and for all. What is GDP? Let's start off with the most obvious point. What is GDP? First off, GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product. What this fundamentally means is that GDP consists of the total value of all the final goods and services that were produced by a country over a specific period of time. Most times you'll find that this time period ranges from anything within a quarter to a year. Perhaps the most important thing that you may need to know about GDP is that essentially it is considered to be one of the best ways, if not the best way, to measure the economic activities of a country. That way, a country can accurately record how much it generated within a specific period of time. With that, you can see how it can also help a country learn about certain things when it comes to the economic activities taking place in its borders. For starters, it can help a country measure the market values of the goods being sold within it. To be more precise, this means that a country is able to determine the monetary value of these goods, not their quantity per se, so you'd find that a luxury cart would probably have more value than a normal car because it has more monetary value. Another thing that you'd find about GDP is that it is only the final goods that are considered when it's being calculated, not components. As such, you'd find that the cost of a burger goes into the GDP, but the costs of the onions and the buns might not be factored in. One more thing that we must point out when it comes to GDP is that, just as we hinted earlier, GDP is only bothered about the goods and services that were produced within a certain period of time. So if you sell an old TV, it won't factor into a country's GDP in the present because it was produced in the past. Components of GDP. Now that we have a basic concept of what GDP is, why don't we look at some of its components? According to some of the experts, it may be best to break GDP down into 4 main components. 1. Consumption. Apparently, this is the amount of money that families and households spend on goods and services. We're talking about anything from groceries to vacations to Dubai. 2. Investment. In this situation, we are talking about investments in things such as equipment, buildings, inventory, residential construction, and the likes. 3. Government purchases. GDP also considered what the government spends on goods and services. 4. Net exports. This is when net exports are calculated against the net imports carried out by a country during a specific period of time. That way, a country can monitor the balance they maintain when it comes to how much they buy from others and how much they sell to others. Real versus nominal GDP. With that in mind, we must also mention that there are 2 types of GDP, real GDP and nominal GDP. You'd find that nominal GDP is the figure you get when you measure the value of all the goods and services at their current price. Meanwhile, you'd find that real GDP considers the same goods and services, but it adjusts its numbers to factor in inflation. You'd also find that real GDP is based on constant prices at the base year. This allows those monitoring the numbers to observe how much actual production has changed over time without the distortion of the changes in prices. This is important because real GDP will allow you to know the value of your money now compared to perhaps the last quarter or the last year. Importance. With that in mind, we can see why it is important to know a country's GDP. Not only does it allow one to know the economic health of the country, it also helps the country when it comes to making policies. For example, if a country finds that their GDP growth isn't looking so good, they might increase the amount of spending to help boost the economy. They may even cut taxes. Does that ever happen? Either way, GDP is also important because it can also help a country know the standard of living of its citizens. One more thing that maintaining a strong GDP may do for its country is help attract foreign investors to put some good money into their country. As such, you can see why it is really important to make sure that your country's GDP is healthy. In view of this, we must mention that the GDP system isn't infallible. For starters, as much as GDP does monitor the activities of households, it only does that to some extent. When GDP is being calculated, you'd find that cooking or childcare doesn't get factored in. Then there is the fact that informal or unreported transactions usually get left out of GDP calculations. Let's also remember that GDP does not factor in environmental factors such as pollution. Finally, GDP doesn't really care about the distribution of wealth in a country. Sure, it gets involved with how much a country generates, but that is its limit. With that in mind, there is much more to GDP than measuring the total value of goods and services that are produced by a country. When we look into it, you'd find that the main goal is to determine how healthy a country's economy is. Notwithstanding the fact that it does not consider all factors, GDP is quite important when it comes to determining government policies as well as the future trajectory of a country. With any luck, this will help you understand how healthy your country's economy is.